And it's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Philomeno.
Hey,
Hi, Flo. Well, so this week we're going to focus on a reputation that France has, that of being a country that's on strike all the time. It certainly can seem like that at times, but are the French really world champions at this, or is this just a stereotype?
Well, like many stereotypes, there is an element of truth to this, and it certainly goes hand in hand with the cliché that the French love to complain all the time. In France, we joke that striking is kind of a national sport, but before we dive in, let's take a look at what we're actually talking about. In French, when you're talking about striking, you talk about la grève, a strike. It's our word du jour, and it's a word so common that a lot of people have told me it's one of the first words that they learn when they're learning French. Now, it's important to note that in France, the right to strike is an individual civil right that's enshrined in the Constitution. It's relatively easy to go on strike, and you don't have to be a member of a trade union.
Well, some would say that there's a striking culture here in France. Where does this tendency to strike come from?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the way social relations work between employees and business owners. In fact, in France, and you probably know this if you follow French news, trade unions wield a lot of power, even though membership is quite low, about 10% in France. It's also a matter of history, because the right to strike was one of the very first social rights acquired by the French. This was in 1864, 20 years before they got the right to unionize. And this 20-year time gap created a culture of workplace power struggles. So in other European countries, you tend to negotiate first and only resort to conflict if talks break down. But in France, it's the opposite. You strike first and talk later. And in France, actually, there are a lot of collective memory. In collective memory, there are a lot of examples of successful strikes. For instance, the general strike in May 1968, or in 1995 when there was a massive strike against pension reform, which might sound familiar.
It does sound familiar. But if you look at the figures here, it appears that France's striking reputation isn't necessarily deserved.
That's right. The results are actually quite striking, Monty. The truth is that it's actually quite tricky to compare countries because there aren't really standardized statistics. But according to comparisons that have been made, it turns out France isn't the worst country. And contrary to what it may seem, the trend has actually been in decline over the years.
People often see France as a country of strikers. I think this notion is quite mistaken. If we look at the figures, the amount of strike actions has decreased drastically over the years. In 1975, 3 million workdays were lost due to walkouts. In 2005, that number was down to 200,000, and even lower in 2015. Some years, there was more strike action in other countries, like Denmark. In 2010, it saw more people walking out on their jobs than anywhere else in Europe.
Well, so if the figures debunk the myth that the French spend their lives on strike, why has this stereotype endured?
Well, some might say it's also part of France's DNA in a way, and it's certainly part of our cultural heritage. There's a certain national glorifications of citizens who have the courage to come together and fight the man. I mean, just think about the French Revolution. And it also might be because the French really have striking down to an art form. It's all about inconvenience and visibility. And that might be a reason why people tend to feel like strikes happen a lot in France. It's because they tend to cause a lot of disruption, particularly travel disruption, and all this gets a lot of media attention. And on top of that, when the French go on strike, they also in general tend to protest loudly. And this is part of a long French tradition of taking to the streets. La manifestation, another French institution. Demonstrations are visible, and the media talks a lot about them, and all this fuels France's militant reputation. You often can get a sense of déjà vu looking at these images of strikes over the years.
For sure. And the reputation of France as being a nation of strikers can actually be costly when it comes to business and foreign investors. What's fascinating is that no matter how disruptive they are, they actually garner a lot of public support, don't they?
Absolutely. The general public has a tendency to accept strikes as a necessary evil for a greater good. And even if people themselves aren't on strike, they kind of are on strike by solidarity in a way. They tend to approve and respect people who fight for their rights, defend their rights, and especially defend what we call les acquis sociaux in France. This is these hard-earned social gains. France has a very generous social protective system, and that didn't fall from the sky after all. People managed to get that system by defending it, by striking, by taking to the streets. And so time and time again, the French grin and bear it, be it during the massive month-long strike from 1995, the 2019 transport strike, or more recently during strikes over President Emmanuel Macron's plan to reform the pension system.
I fully support them. Because we're sick and tired of being treated like cattle.
1h03 le matin, 1h03 le soir.
Et alors?
Et alors, bah, c'est la galère.
Moi, je marche pas, je suis en roller. J'ai quand même mal aux pieds, je suis fatigué.
Je pense qu'ils défendent leurs intérêts, ce qui est logique. Maintenant, que les gens soient pris en otage, je suis pas complètement convaincue que c'est comme ça qu'on y arrive.
C'est très angoissant en fait, surtout. Le temps, la rigueur, c'est pas grave, mais c'est l'angoisse de la foule.
Il y en a marre.
Je les comprends par contre. Les revendications, je les comprends entièrement. On est tous concernés.
Je comprends le droit de grève, mais en fait, vraiment, vous nous cassez les pieds.
And I think that lady really sums it up quite perfectly. Public support for these strikes, for the civil disorder, which can be surprising abroad, but also complaining about it because this is France after all.
It certainly is, and very familiar scenes there. Okay, thanks a lot, Flo. Well, that's it for this edition of French Connections. In the meantime, you can tweet your questions at Flo Villemino, and you can check out past episodes by visiting our website, france24.com.